Chapter 8 of 9 Months in the United States During a Crisis, by the Reverend George Fisch. This is recorded to celebrate the 9th anniversary of LibriVox. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Chapter 8. National Character. Up to the present, we have been studying the United States in those spheres in which the religious life exercises a direct action, first in the church, and next in the system of education. We now advance a step further, and consider it in its less direct operation upon national manners and character. In the first two spheres it works without impediment, but this is not the case when it seeks to penetrate and leaven the mass of material interests, inveterate habits, and secular institutions. There is something analogous to this in the history of every man. When Christianity has wrought an entire change in our thoughts and feelings, does it not often encounter in our habits and character a resistance which it only triumphs over by dint of daily and incessant struggles? Hence those amazing inconsistencies we must all at times have observed in men whose sincere faith is beyond question. If it be thus in that inner stronghold where each man comes into collision with himself alone, how must it be with a whole people, a people, too, who are made up of the elements of all other nations? We are to bear in mind that America is composed of the most indomitable materials of our old Europe. In the large towns these exist as vast, compact masses, utterly inaccessible to the combined influences of manners, education, or church. Any other religion than one based directly upon conscience would have yielded before such a state of things. To produce any sensible effect under such circumstances is a miracle, like that wrought by the Church in the early ages of Christianity. Moreover, the tremendous battle the latter had to wage developed all its energies, whilst in America resistance is masked by external acquiescence. Truth fears no foe that meets it face to face. The lion's tooth is less dangerous than the serpent's venom, and yet little account is made of the obstacles the American Church has encountered in its progress. One might suppose we were exempted from the duty of being equitable towards a people who have the misfortune of living at such a distance from us. No doubt there are exceptions that compensate, and more than compensate, for the injustice of which America is the victim. A country appreciated as America has been in France by such men as de Tocqueville, Ampère, La Boulaye, and others, has not got much to complain of. Unfortunately, the great mass of men are more given to count than to weigh testimonies. While they bow before these observers or judges of the highest order, they suffer themselves to be influenced by the scandalous chronicles published by vulgar tourists. These amusing narratives succeed on the same principle as does the caricature. It is easier to find men ready to laugh at a people than to follow their example. It would be a curious study, the tissue of myths that might be called the legends of the United States, showing that there are people who most sincerely imagine they have seen what others told them, and that for travelers, as well as for historians, there exists a common fund of tradition that is taken for granted by each individual. Besides, when people are coming back from the land of humbug, they must bring with them some favorite specimens, and when they travel as fast as steam can carry them, they have no choice but to conclude from the particular to the general. Thus, when they have seen some drunken woman in a certain quarter of New York, where the dregs of the German and Irish population congregate, they conclude at once that American women are totally corrupt. Nevertheless, the most prejudiced men are forced to acknowledge that in the American character and manners there are features that can only be accounted for by the influence of strong religious convictions. We have already noticed the respect paid to women and the perfect freedom of relations that is the consequence. The credit of this has been given to the instincts of the Anglo-Saxon race, by tracing this effect up to the forests of old Germany. But if this were the explanation, why do not the virtues that distinguish America, Scotland, and England flourish in the same degree in Germany, the lineal descendant of the people described by Tacitus? Why are those superior morals only found in countries where Puritanism, this vigorous though excessive development of the Calvinistic spirit, has left its impress, in countries, in a word, where the Holy Scriptures are held to be the supreme law, to be appealed to upon all occasions? From this same source the American people derive their amazing energy. Their very origin preaches the sacrifices demanded by strong conviction. It is a title of nobility to a people to descend from men who were martyrs for their faith, and it is with pious pride the Yankees show the relics of the first pilgrims. It is impossible to look without emotion at the wretched wooden armchair that constituted in itself the whole furniture of one of those venerable fathers, and which is carefully preserved in a public library at Boston. Such examples for America yield richer veins of golden ore than all the mines of California. It is after having contemplated them that the sons of the wealthy families of New England set out to till and cultivate the lands of the far West. They make their way through a wilderness of forests by means of railroads, which in Europe link populations together, but which in America begin by forming them. A new line is traced through a virgin forest along a road extending hundreds of leagues. The trees are cut down, laid crosswise, rails are placed on them, and stations marked out, following close on each other. The first train starts almost empty. It stops at first only for form's sake, meeting at each station but one solitary being, the station master, who is there alone in these wild woods, with no communication whatever with the outer world but through this train that passes once a day. Presently a family of emigrants come. They build themselves a log house, and lie on the hard, damp ground, disputing with vipers and rattlesnakes the possession of their little dwelling. And yet at the doors of these wretched cabins you may see fresh, merry children shouting out loud huzzas at the approach of the train. This struggle, as it were man to man with nature, is a sort of luxury to men of vigorous, stalwart mettle, who, having mastered themselves, are able to master everything else, but the sufferings to be endured are beyond description. The first winters they have to pass in log houses, in an icy temperature of 40 degrees below zero centigrade. You meet in the eastern states women, still young, who, after having been brought up in the lap of luxury, have followed their husbands into these far-off settlements. Their adventures exceed anything we read of in the experience of Robinson. Such modes of life are a long martyrdom. One day the log house is buried under snow, or threatened to be carried off bodily by inundation, or, what frequently occurs, is attacked by the Indians. Again, it is impossible to cut through or melt the ice. Accordingly, all communication is cut off, and the inmates pass days in all the horrors of hunger. It is impossible to look without emotion at those small, delicate hands that have had to wield alternately the axe and the gun, and to carry the heaviest burthens. The health of these women is often destroyed, but their wills never flinch. Narratives of this kind, and letters which have the palpitating interest of reality and the fascination of the marvelous, keep up in the hearts of the Yankees this obscure heroism which has more real glory in it than that of the battlefield. The energy and audacity of the American are summed up in the famous "Go ahead," the golden rule of American wisdom. Held within certain limits and applied to matters of conscience, this watchword is eminently Christian. By following it, the Church of the first ages triumphed over the assaults of paganism. But carried into the sphere of material things, this principle runs the risk of changing its nature. Still, it remains the master spring that urges on to great things. To shrink from no impossibility constitutes the American's danger, but it is also the secret by which he works prodigies. True, the captains of the steamers navigating the Ohio and Mississippi often, in their efforts to outrun a rival, cause their own boilers to explode, but the untamed extravagance of a young people intoxicated with the air they breathe, and treating danger with supreme indifference, is being corrected day by day. In the states of the Northeast, which are more sober and self-possessed, these dangers are no longer incurred by travelers. In these countries that have long been colonized, and long since freed from the infatuation produced by slavery, the go-ahead expresses nothing more than the indomitable resolution to overcome all obstacles. If a young man embraces the commercial career, you may be very sure that, after having 20 times laid his hand on fortune, he will end in not again letting her escape him. If he makes a discovery, he will have the press to puff it with invincible persistency, and after spending in this way fabulous sums, will end, like a certain character in Philadelphia, in constructing magnificent edifices for lodging his merchandise. If he is a student of law, he at once aspires to become President of the United States. Here success is more difficult, for popular favor is capricious. Those immeasurably ambitious men are often very unscrupulous as to the means they employ. They nevertheless form statesmen of the highest order. From time to time they learn that the surest way of attaining their object is to march right onward in the path of duty. Mr. Douglas and Mr. Lincoln, both from Illinois, are men who began life with the rude labors of the farm. Douglas's ambition from his boyhood was to be president. Lincoln had no other ideal than that of obeying his conscience. They frequently clashed in their political careers, and at the last election they both found themselves candidate for the presidential chair, the one because he had made it the aim of his life, the other because his incorruptible honesty had made him the fit man for the situation. Douglas, whose constant dream had been to be the master of the White House, died a month after he had seen his rival's installation. This lesson, we hope, will not be thrown away upon America. With this principle, that nothing is impossible, the American performs positive miracles in the material world. I saw at Worcester one evening an enormous object through which light was streaming, blocking up the middle of the street. This was a house, with all its inmates inside, traveling along on rollers. I asked the pastor of Newton Corner what had become of his church. He pointed it out to me 100 steps further on. It had been carried off bodily, belfry and all. We had some difficulty in Europe in believing that the soil of the central part of Chicago had been elevated 10 feet by means of screws. Yet it is a positive fact. Blocks of houses, 6 or 7 stories high, of brick and granite, were raised up at the same time. No one left his house, only from time to time steps were added to the stairs. Another trait of character which is not foreign to the influence of the gospel is the high estimation in which labor is held in America. A nation loving Christ cannot forget that it was said of the Savior of the world, "Is this not the carpenter's son?" This is one of the greatest causes of opposition created by slavery between the North and the South. The Americans of the free states have broken away from the traditions of those ages that glorified idleness. In their eyes, idleness is high treason against society. The richest merchants continue going to their counting houses early in the morning. I heard a gentleman at New York say that his brother's piety was only external. And why? The old man of 72, of immense wealth, was living upon his property and had given up working. Success, laboriously won, is the true nobility in the eyes of the Americans. Each man's glory is to be a self-made man, that is to say, a man who is the creator of his own fortune. While General Banks was governor of Massachusetts, a book was sold in profusion, entitled The Bobbin Boy. This was the biography of His Excellency, who had begun life by earning a few pence a day in a spinning factory, and had risen by his merit to the highest post in the most enlightened state of the Union. I was present on the day he was taking leave, and laying down his office, and was able to judge of the enthusiastic respect in which he was held. One of his predecessors, Mr. Briggs, who had been a hatter, died lately, the object of universal veneration. In fact, if we wish to see equality realized here below in manners, we must look for it in the agricultural districts of the northern states. Equality is an idea that Christianity brought into the world by bowing down the head of the powerful and the weak, of the master and the slave, before him who was the servant of all, and at the same time their Lord and their God. But nothing is more difficult than to put this into practice. The law may recognize it as a right, but that it may become a fact, it requires manners that have been thoroughly and constantly imbued with Christian feeling. Now this is preeminently the case in New England. If we accept the Irish emigrant, who continues on a poor ignorant workman to the second or third generation, you meet in the agricultural parts of these 6 states but one single class, one single social scale. There may be men more or less rich, more or less easy in circumstances, some of whom are farmers, some merchants or magistrates, but all are well-informed, enlightened men, in whose habits, dress, language, and mode of living there is little difference. That variety of the human species called the peasant is not known. There are whole districts where not a single poor man could be found. It is impossible to conceive anything more happy than the populations that live along the enchanting banks of the noble river Connecticut. They are a healthy, vigorous, active, thriving race, ready to acknowledge most thankfully that they have received the best heritage that can be enjoyed here below. In contemplating such a scene, one's thoughts revert to the benedictions promised by the old prophet, when every man shall sit in peace beneath his own vine and fig tree. But equality is not the exclusive appanage of New England. We meet it everywhere. The railways have but one class of wagons, except the special trains at reduced price reserved for emigrants. The senator takes his seat by the side of the plowman and the artisan, who make it a point of honor to deserve the confidence with which they are treated. You may travel from one end of the United States to the other without hearing one single coarse expression. The city of Washington, the capital of the Union, reflects this equality in a striking manner. The buildings consecrated to the public service are gigantic and splendid. On the contrary, the President himself inhabits the modest villa called the White House. Before the war, Mr. Lincoln could be seen at all hours. He has only 2 or 3 servants, none of whom are in livery. I called upon him in company with one of my American friends. The President was engaged, it not being his hour of receiving. No matter, feeling that he owed himself to all, he welcomed us with the utmost kindness and cordiality. I had the pleasure of pressing that strong, robust hand, hardened by toil, and contemplating at my ease the face of this rustic man with its angular features, its immense brow, expressive of rare energy, its frank, open, intelligent, and mild look, its expression of honest loyalty and perfect rectitude. I took upon myself to express the sympathy entertained for himself personally and for his administration by the liberal portion of the French nation, and to assure him of the hearty prayers offered to heaven in behalf of the cause he represents. When speaking to Mr. Lincoln of that God whose support is now so necessary to him, he became deeply moved. My friend was much struck at the expression that passed over his manly countenance. Mrs. Lincoln then received us, and we sat and chatted as though we had been old acquaintances. I paid a second visit to the White House with a lady living in the town of Washington. Mr. Lincoln was unable to receive us. My friend insisted on our being admitted. The perplexity of the servant, who was obliged to resist all entreaties, presented a strange contrast to the rude contempt one is subjected to from the valets of our European grandees. What can be finer than this union of simplicity and power? This courteous, modest gentleman is he, at whose word 22 millions of men sprang up, ready to sacrifice their treasures and their lives. But there are shadows to this picture. America is meeting immense difficulties in her path. There are gaps and shortcomings in the national character visible at the first glance. Now the majority of travelers see nothing but these defects, and to us in Europe they are presented through an enormous magnifying glass. The different forms and combinations of these constitute the various shades of notions entertained by Europeans regarding the Americans. Let us endeavor to come to a more equitable judgment on the subject by examining the causes that may explain them. The foremost of these defects is national pride. At first sight, it would appear as if all nations in this respect were on a par, but it cannot be denied that, up to recent events, American pride had assumed the proportions of the New World itself, where everything is on a gigantic scale. Compared with the Mississippi and the St. Lawrence, our rivers are mere streams. The Yankee sails up and down these magnificent waters in floating palaces 3 stories high, in company with 400 or 500 fellow travelers. He gets through the 1,800 miles that separate New York from New Orleans, as we go from Paris to Havre, and he thinks as lightly as crossing the ocean as we do the English Channel. When he visits our European Confederation, he reckons that in a few days he will have done all our great cities, London, Paris, Petersburg, Constantinople, taking in Jerusalem and Cairo as well. His scale of dimensions is that of Gargantua. He fancies we have hardly elbow room in our small states. We must add to this that up to late events this young nation had seen its most daring dreams all realized, its most iniquitous enterprises succeed. They had driven without mercy or pity the unfortunate Indians from the soil owned by their ancestors. These magnificent countries now form powerful republics. Filibusterers wrested Texas from Mexico, the latter making a show of resistance. The Americans declared it a most unjust war, and took half its territory, discovering subsequently that this newly conquered California was one of the richest countries in the world. Is it to be wondered at that the nation should feel its head grow dizzy as it contemplated upon its new charts the enormous extent of territory that had fallen to its lot, a world almost the size of Europe, resting upon 2 oceans, and destined by its very configuration to be the dwelling of a unique people? What a future is prepared for the United States by the increase of their population, which surpasses all that has ever been heard of in the annals of statistics. 60 years ago, New York contained 56,000 souls. Now this imperial city, including its suburbs, has a population of nearly 1.5 million. If it goes on at the present ratio, it will reach 7 millions at the end of the century. Chicago will have 5 millions at the same period if all goes on smoothly. A calculation that seems prophetic, published by Elkanah Wilson in 1815, announced that the population of the United States would be, to speak in round numbers, about 9 millions in 1820, 12 in 1830, 17 in 1840, 23 in 1850, 31 in 1860, 42 in 1870, 56 in 1880, 77 in 1890, 100 in 1900, and 283 millions in the year 2000. Now here are the real figures up to the present day. In 1820, 9,638,000. In 1830, 12,866,000. In 1840, 17,116,000. In 1850, 23,191,000. In 1860, 31,429,000. The extraordinary exactness with which this calculation has been fulfilled in the past may be taken as a guarantee of its future accuracy. The American, who troubles himself very little about the end of the world, already discounts the year 2000. He multiplies in thought tenfold the actual population, and in this he is the more justified, seeing that we may say of this rapidly increasing figure as of the flight of time, that as we speak of it, it is already changed. How is it possible, then, that this people should be otherwise than proud? Besides, prodigious as their pride is, it makes no void round about them. It is a frank, outspoken pride without superciliousness or contempt, at least in the North. The American can admire with enthusiasm all that is great in other people, and for France their predilection is not diminished. Even our defects they hold up as virtues. Lafayette continues to be a sort of hyphen between these two great nations, similar in so many respects. The pride, too, of the citizen of the United States is his patriotism. It comes from a boundless faith in the excellence of American institutions, and of their future working for the welfare of all humanity. This people believes in its destiny. When the inhabitants of the at first obscure town of Rome began by believing in their destiny, it was but a superstition. Here, on the contrary, it is a deliberate conviction, supported both by the dispensations of Providence and by the intrinsic value of the principles upon which this new society is based. But these extenuating circumstances do not lessen the fact that individuals partake but too much of the great pride of the nation, and herein we find one of the most formidable obstacles to moral and religious progress. A proud people may be perfectly orthodox, but they cannot reach the deep sources whence proceed the true Christian life. This was made very evident during the financial crisis of 1857. No sooner did humiliation come upon America than with it was produced one of the most glorious religious revivals the Church has ever witnessed. It will be the same after this war, which has already swallowed up the wealth which required half a century for its accumulation. But it is not in the papers we must look for the symptoms of this humiliation, for even after the defeat of Bull's Run, the journals vied with each other in crying out that the attitude of the North in presence of this catastrophe was the sublimest spectacle the sun ever shone upon. Thoroughly to understand this salutary subjective change that has been thus wrought, one should have lived in America before and after the outbreak of the war. All is altered: ideas, feelings, language. How often latterly I have heard Americans bewail their pride. At the very moment when this people, like Nebuchadnezzar over his Babylon, were glorifying themselves upon their greatness, they were laid prostrate in the dust. The half-finished constructions that were to make the federal capital the most splendid palace in the universe, the prodigious columns, composed of one solid block of white marble, which were to surround the entire edifice, and which now lie about sadly in the neglected yards, the gigantic base of Washington's monument, a new Tower of Babel to which all the kingdoms of the world contributed a stone, and which was to surpass in height the pyramids of Egypt, all those unfinished symbols of unparalleled greatness preach with tremendous eloquence the words of Scripture, "He that exalteth himself shall be brought low." The second national sin is an unbridled love of gain. This is the consequence of the unexampled material prosperity which the United States has enjoyed. In the same way that the descendants of the Huguenot refugees became the wealthiest citizens of their adopted countries, the sons of the Pilgrims have been loaded with the wealth which their fathers sacrificed. The earth pours her treasures into their laps and gives them with profusion the produce of all other parts of the world. In certain districts mineral oil shoots up pure as the water of our fountains. Agricultural productions are tripled by the skillful use of machinery. Land increases in value at a fabulous ratio. A few dollars suffice to buy land in the West, which soon brings 20,000 times the price originally paid for it. An American friend of mine set out for the Minnesota with $5 or $6 in his pocket, with which he bought a considerable property. A town was built upon his domain, and he came back to the East a millionaire. Having had no enemies to fear, the nation have been able to dispense with a standing army. Territories have been sold in detail, some of which were greater than France. They were actually beginning not to know what to do with the revenues of the state. It is evident that it was impossible for this young, impetuous nation to do otherwise than rush upon the pursuit of wealth with a kind of frenzy. This passion was still more stimulated by the rapid immigration that was going on. 500,000 Europeans, whose heads were filled with the one thought of making fortunes, annually landed on the shores of this El Dorado. Besides, the commercial organization of America seems calculated to intensify this thirst for gold. There is no restraint whatever on the liberty of business transactions. The interest on money is enormous. Usury is neither interfered with by law nor stigmatized by public opinion. In December 1860, loans were made at New York at 36% per month and even at 3% per diem. On the suppression of the National Bank, private banks, and the most insignificant village has its own bank, issued paper, often exceeding 100-fold the gold they had in reserve. Sometimes these banks are mere fictions. In Missouri, I was paid in notes on the Bank of Tecama, and discovered when it was too late that no such locality was in existence. The most daring speculations are carried on upon credit. It is a game of chance, and if you succeed you are a rich man. If not, you are not ruined, for this word is not to be found in the vernacular of American commerce. You have only to begin once more. In Europe we are indignant at the facility with which a New York merchant makes his fortune a second time after having been bankrupt. In the United States, on the contrary, they glory in the fact. Here we crush the man who falls. There they endeavor to help him up. This, perhaps, is real charity. In all cases it is a good calculation, for they say to themselves, to smash the man who is your debtor is most assuredly not the best way to secure payment. Most of the fortunes at New York have been made and remade over and over again. Millions rise and fall by turns like the waves of a troubled sea. Men get seasoned by this spectacle, and are neither surprised to find themselves after a few years princes in the finance world, or beggars at the end of a few days' commercial crisis. This fluctuating wealth is but too often employed in extravagance, and as to the piles of gold that filled to overflowing the coffers of the state, a very simple process of depletion was found, which passed under the modest name of dilapidation. When the present administration undertook the direction of affairs, it had to begin its labors with the task of cleaning the stables of Augeas. It will be long before the principles of disinterestedness and political probity have taken the place due to them amongst a people who in so many other respects are eminently moral. Another defect in the national character is its excessive mobility. The French, who pass for the most fickle of people, are in this respect surpassed by our transatlantic cousins. Our old societies could not stand the perpetual fluctuations to which this growing people are constantly subject. One is inclined to imagine that the excessive capriciousness of the climate, in which, in the course of the day, you pass from summer to winter, and from winter to summer, acting from childhood upon the nervous system, may affect the character. If the Scandinavian is dreamy, if the Calabrian has fire in his blood, why should not the American follow in some degree the oscillations of his thermometer? Nothing can be more singular than to see this people sink in a few days from a paroxysm of enthusiasm to one of indignation. Next to nothing suffices to elevate a man to the pedestal of an incomparable hero, and the chances are that, in a few weeks after, he will be looked upon as either a monster or an idiot. The American press is responsible for much of this inconstancy. Its task might be a noble one, were it understood, for no people in the world read journals as the Americans do. More than 200 papers are published in the city of New York, upwards of 400 in Philadelphia, and every village has its daily paper. The child of 10 devours the political articles, and deliberately chooses the political party to which he shall give his adhesion. Unfortunately, in the United States, as in other countries, journalism has been too long left in the hands of irreligious men. With some honorable exceptions, the American papers are written in a galvanic, spasmodic style. They have nothing but superlatives and hyperboles in their vocabulary. What they praise surpasses the height of all human excellence. What they blame exceeds the measure of human perversity. There are journals called sensation papers, simply because they circulate each day the most absurd reports, by which the masses invariably allow themselves to be duped. The principle that rules in the United States regarding moral and physical dangers is that each individual should count upon himself alone for getting out of difficulties. Railway companies run trains through the streets of the most populous towns. There are neither barriers nor enclosures. The engineer just rings a lugubrious bell that may be heard 2 miles off. This must suffice you. But if you happen to be deaf, so much the worse for you. Why don't you look at the rails that cross the paths and the placard that gives you notice in large letters? In the same way, the state gives you the least possible protection. The most respectable men, the most firmly rooted Republicans, are flung by journalists as food to public emotion. In this country, where every man in some way or other is public property, people think they have a right to discuss freely men as well as things. Make up your mind to see yourself torn to pieces, ridiculed, sneered at in every way. You have the tribunals, it is true, but they are expensive and not to be counted on. You have the revolver. Happily, this is little used in the North. But you have better than all that, an individuality of the strongest die, to which all these gymnastics are but child's play. Besides, we know that this mobility is merely on the surface, and can rely on the good sense of an intelligent, enlightened, persistent, and resolute people, who quietly allow the ebb and flow of praise and blame to pass, because they are perfectly able to discern who are their real friends. Were it otherwise, who would dare be President of the United States? A month after Mr. Lincoln's inauguration, the 2 great journals whose patronage secured his nomination gravely proposed to him to abdicate as being incapable for his post. I could not avoid expressing my amazement at this to one of the principal editors. "Oh, it is nothing," he said. "We are once more the best friends in the world." End of Chapter 8 of 9 Months in the United States During the Crisis, by the Reverend George Fisch.